My name is Evelyn Claire Harper. I'm 36 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, in a small, sunlit apartment above a bakery that smells of cinnamon every morning. I work as a pediatric speech therapist, which is how I spend most of my days, sitting on low chairs, shaping sounds so a 6-year-old can say thank you without stumbling, wiping tears from the face of a 10-year-old who has been told his speech will always be different, roaring with laughter with a child who finally gets a tongue twister right. My life is quiet in a way I used to confuse with safe. I have a partner, Jonah, who makes coffee that tastes like patience, and a rescue dog named Mabel who snores like a washing machine. I sleep well, mostly. I keep my apartment tidy, and I collect tiny ceramic birds on the windowsill because I like that they look hopeful from across the street. But safe is a tenuous word when family is involved. I was adopted at 3, picked up from a county hospital by people who would become my adoptive family, the Whitakers, who live in a house that smells of old wood and lemon oil, 2 hours east, in a town that remembers every family name. For the first 25 years of my life, they were everything. The household where my hair was braided every Sunday, where I scraped my knee on the back porch and was scolded and kissed. But those memories sit on top of darker ones. The nights my adoptive mother, Marlene, locked me in a closet because I'd cried too long. The years of quiet remarks from my adoptive sister, Claire, about how we made more of ourselves than some children do. My adoptive father's hands that were sometimes steady and sometimes strict in a way that left me holding my breath. When I say they invited me, I mean the message arrived like an olive branch with a thorn. Thanksgiving dinner. An attempt at healing. Please come. I'd been estranged for 7 years. They knew the edges of my life. They knew I was stable. They knew I had created a small, honest life. But they also knew how to make the word home sting. I was sure the invitation wasn't innocent. For weeks I told myself I would not go. For weeks I told myself things that are easier said at 3 in the morning when insomnia has you naked with your thoughts. That I would not go and reopen wounds. That is, until I sat across from Jonah and told him how small the message looked on my phone, and he looked at me with a softness that was not pity, the kind that feels like a hand offered, and said, "What do you want this to be, Ev?" What I wanted, in truth, was something I hadn't heard since I was a child. An apology that landed like a real thing, not like a script. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. I don't say that lightly. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The weeks leading up to the invitation sharpened habits in me. I began waking at 5, brewing tea, and reading through old journals. I read a page where I had written, "Maybe they'll love me if I'm useful," and I felt the familiar clench in my throat, the way a muscle remembers a past injury when you think of it. I started to rehearse not what I would say, but how I would breathe. My therapist taught me diaphragmatic breaths to keep panic from scrambling my words. My friend Lena recorded me speaking so I could hear the cadence of my own voice and not find it foreign. The nostalgia of the Whitaker house is a smell as much as anything else. Lemon oil, old wood, pies cooling on windowsills, the hum of a gas stove. It is also the smell of cigarettes in the ashtrays no one noticed they left on the side table after guests. The town itself is a place where flags are always at half-mast for someone, where the post office knows everyone's name. It is the kind of town that holds your childhood like something fragile under glass. You can look at it from the outside and see every scratch. There's something about going back to a place that raised you and then tried to break you that feels like walking into a room to find a mirror smashed on the floor. You know you could pick up a shard and cut your palm on a truth you did not expect to find. For me, the shards were small. Comments that had once seemed like jokes, accusations dressed as concern, 1,000 little rejections that in aggregate felt like a verdict. I find in memory a soundtrack. The creak of the back staircase they had never fixed, the way Marlene's voice softened when she wanted me to listen, the laugh of Claire when a joke landed at my expense. When I packed my bag, I put in a sweater that had belonged to my teacher in high school, a talisman of a mentor who had once told me I had a quiet force. I packed a box of photographs, years of black and white smiles my mother had hoarded, and a folder with things I'd written as a child, letters never sent, doodles of birds. I didn't pack weapons or plans. I packed evidence in the form of my own life. The job I had, the apartment, the friends who loved me, the stability that had been denied to me as a child and that I had created with my own hands. The drive east felt like a slow unpeeling. Portland's grey morning gave way to peppermint green farmland, and then to the pocked asphalt of the Midwestern highway that led to the Whitaker homestead. Rain had been predicted and then cancelled, but the air smelled of petrichor and something else, the faint tang of diesel and someone frying onions at a diner. I love the way a road trip makes you recollect scenes set to a rhythm, the way trees blur into a watercolor, the way your thoughts click like a camera taking snapshots. For 2 hours, I listened to a playlist that was part courage, part nostalgia. Old songs that had been in my childhood house, new songs I played in my car on treks to grow. When I arrived, the house looked smaller than it did in my memory, as if distance had given it dignity I had now stripped away. The porch light blinked, and a wreath, too perfectly round, hung on the door. Claire answered first. She is 40, 2 years my elder, sharp-jawed in a way that is somehow both pretty and predatory. She hugged me like someone measuring a rug. "Evelyn," she said, and there was a pause, the kind you get when someone's trying to remember which script they're supposed to say. "You look good. You look well," I said and meant it. The living room smelled exactly like I remembered, lemon oil and wood polish and something with cinnamon. There were framed family photos in matching frames, my face in a child-sized dress in one, smiling, my hand painted like a clay handprint. There were also adjustments designed to destabilize. My picture was placed slightly off the visual center of the mantel, a tiny social cue for the doubly adopted child we all had been taught to notice. Dinner that night was an exercise in subtle barbs. My adoptive mother, Marlene, asked about my practice with an interest that never landed without the sting of comparison. "Do you remember when you used to be so loud at rehearsals?" she'd ask, then laugh at my discomfort. My adoptive father, Thomas, told stories about how he remembered the real Whitakers and smirked in a way that made the room tilt. It began as a quiet hum of tension that grew louder as more relatives arrived. Cousins who had once been friends and were now people who knew how to apply a gentle, surgical shame. A cousin named April, who had always been Whisper Queen, commented on my city hair, and how different it was now. A neighbor, who I recognized as someone who had once watched me on the porch swing, told a joke about how some kids are perpetual guests. I cultivated a mask, one I've learned to wear when children cry in clinic halls and parents ask ugly questions. It is the mask of too much composure, polite and white-knuckled. Under it my palms sweated and my mouth tasted of metal. There were small physical sensations that returned with old triggers. My chest tightened as if someone had wrapped a belt too tight beneath my ribs. My fingers tingled. I had the sudden, sharp, infantile urge to curl into Jonah or Mabel and hide. My breathing sometimes stuck halfway, and when that happened I pictured the diaphragmatic breaths and practiced them under the table. At one point, Claire cut into me with a thin smile. "So what is it like, Ev? Being a real adult without us?" There was a laugh from the table, the noise of the kind of people who have rehearsed cruelty. It landed like a pebble in a pond and set off ripples. My throat closed. For a second, I was that kid in the closet where the air tasted like dust and fear. Then I remembered the letters I had tucked into my jacket, handwritten notes from a teacher who had once said I was luminous in small things, a card from a child I had helped teach to say, "Mama," with clarity and delight. I put my hand over the folder like a talisman. Over the course of the evening, I watched a pattern emerge. The Whitakers are performers of propriety. They have sharpened themselves on a craft of social dignity. They are the people who will get a standing ovation at charity galas and then return home and clip flowers with a smile that never touches their eyes. Their version of making amends had always been a thing to be broadcast. Statements that sounded generous but came with fine print. There was this one moment, small, almost shot through like a seam, when Marlene took my hand. "We're glad you came, Evelyn," she said, and for a second the voice was soft enough to be a truism I could almost believe. But then she added, almost under her breath, "But let's be honest about things. We have standards in this family." The room laughed. My cheeks heated. "If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I say that because I know shame loves silence, and silence is where monsters grow." Comment if you've ever felt belittled at family gatherings. Your words matter and I'm reading everything. Sleep that night was an achy, shallow thing. I lay in the guest room I had once claimed as mine, and felt a child memory chase me like a moth. I replayed scenes and dialogues, as if examining them might reveal a point I had missed. I breathed in lemon oil and tried to find a rhythm. The house sighed in the night, a settling sound that once felt like home and now felt like a countdown. I knew the attempt was coming. I had felt the gravitational pull of their template. Make it public, make it sharp, let the community be witness. The question in my stomach was whether I would be the thing they would use to sharpen themselves, or whether I would step off the stage they had built and speak differently. They set the stage like it was a performance, and in many ways it was. The living room was arranged with chairs in a semicircle. There was a projector screen, which I found oddly theatrical for a family apology. Claire called it a small presentation, and her smile had the calculus of someone who knows where the cameras would be in her mind. I watched as my old friends and neighbors, people who had known me as a child, filled the chairs. The air felt charged as if someone had rubbed a balloon and was ready to let the shock fly. Marlene stood and cleared her throat. She told a story about how she had raised me, and how we'd always known it would be complicated, a way of apology that was already a deflection. My stomach turned. At the side, Claire flicked a remote and the screen lit up with photos of my childhood, birthday candles, me in a costume, shots with other children. They had accompanied each image with a caption that was carefully calibrated, loved her like family, but then slowly slipping into language designed to undermine. But she never quite had the same grit as we did. There was an audible intake of breath from someone in the front row. The room was prepped for the reveal, to highlight my differences and make them into evidence of failure. "You're proud of where we've come from, Ev," Claire said later, when it was her turn. "You should be. But you should also admit you had help. People in our position should be grateful." The words were propped up like polite knives. My mouth tasted of pennies. A cousin made a joke about how some people are natural-born celebrities, and the laughter had the cruelness of people who had been rehearsed to respond. I felt panic rising. My hands went cold and my fingers pricked. I thought for a moment I would stand up and leave. I thought about the cheap sanctity of the Whitakers' apology, and the way it would spread through the town like warmed butter. I thought of the 7 years I had built a life without them, of the nights I had lain awake making lists, small things I had done to survive and large things I had done to thrive. I thought of my students' faces, the ones who looked at me as proof that a body could be mended. When Claire reached the crescendo she had planned, a thin laugh, a statement about community expectations, I surprised myself with what I did instead of what I had rehearsed. I took a breath and stood up. Not to flee, but to claim space. "Before you say anything else," I began, and my voice was steadier than I felt, "I want to show you something." There was a murmur. Claire's eyes narrowed a fraction. Marlene's lips pursed. I opened the folder I had tucked into my jacket. For a moment, the briefest, no one moved. My hands shook, just a little. I slid out a stack of letters and photographs that I had not planned to use as weapons. They were instruments of truth. "I could hand you my degree," I said, "or my professional license. I could tell you about my clients, about the boy I taught to say, 'Mama,' last spring. The mother who cried in my office because for the first time she could understand her child. But that's not why I'm standing. I'm standing because you have rehearsed shame as a currency and used it against me my whole life." I read from a letter, handwritten, small blue pen loops, written by a woman named Teresa, a teacher in my town who had watched me at 6 years old and scribbled notes to my adoptive mother insisting the child be given equal attention. I read the part where Teresa wrote, "She flinches at loud voices. She needs steadiness, not sermons." I read another note from a neighbor who remembered overhearing my father yelling at me for coming home 2 minutes late, calling me a complication. As I read, memories, painful, small, lit up in the people around me like Christmas lights. Marlene leaned back in her chair. Claire's face passed through a shade that looked like panic. "This isn't about trophies," I said. It's about the fact that you think you can sit a room and decide how someone else should feel about themselves. You invited me here under the guise of reconciliation, and instead you brought a projector and people prepared to laugh. There was an audible shuffle. My voice softened. I have spent years learning the language of my own heart. I have therapy notes that taught me how not to make myself small so other people can look bigger. I have clients who trust me with their first words. I have built a life that exists without needing your applause. A neighbor, Mr. Harlan, who had once been a quiet ally when I was a child, stirred and said, "Evelyn." His voice was small. "We didn't." "I know what you practiced," I interrupted gently. "You practiced good speeches and scandalized mouths. But you didn't practice listening. You didn't practice admitting when you were cruel. You practiced being a community that looks good while it polishes its feet on someone else's dignity." There was a silence then, like a held breath. 4 years, they'd been the ones who defined public narratives about families. Who was respectable, who was not. Tonight, the audience's eyes were not only on me, they were on the Whitakers. That shift matters. Claire rose, angrily, to argue. "You are twisting this," she said. "We were being honest. We wanted to perform forgiveness," I finished for her. "To stage it so it looked like healing without bearing any price." The room was hot. The projector hummed, if only to mock. Marlene's face had gone grey. There was a tremor in her hands as she clutched the arm of her chair. I kept speaking. I told a story I had never told them in those terms. How at 6 years old I'd learned to be invisible to keep a storm from starting. How I had made a secret of my hunger so that no one had to be inconvenienced. How I'd held a childhood together by pretending to be easier than I was. I told them about the nights in high school when I'd sleep with my shoes on because I was too nervous to risk losing time if I had to leave. I told them about the closet and about finding ways to breathe around them. There were faces in the room I had not expected to respond. A cousin I had not seen in years, Marcus, stood and said simply, "I remember you as a kid who fixed bikes for us when it rained and never wanted a thing." There was a quiet chorus of small affirmations that I had built my life without their blessing. I didn't leave with a trophy of victory. The room didn't erupt into applause. Instead, I left them speechless in a way I think is worse than shame because silence demands the work of reflection, and they had not planned for that. After I spoke, the room fragmented into 1,000 small conversations. Some people retreated to corners like wounded birds. Others clung to their scripts, repeating the lines they'd prepared as if repetition made them true. Claire tried to regain center stage by making accusations. "You're making this about you again." And Marlene, who had been the architect of many small cruelties I had endured, found her own voice slack and unsure. "Why would you do this?" Marlene asked, tearful but not wholly repentant, "when we were trying to fix things?" "Because the work of fixing belongs to the people who harmed," I said. "It can't be a show. It can't be a press release. It has to be messy and difficult." My breath felt like a drum in my chest. Saying the word messy made me realize how much I wanted something genuine over something performative. Thomas, my adoptive father, sat silent in his armchair, and the quiet felt full. You could almost hear the click of his mind turning through old narratives of pride. His eyes, which once could make me small in a word, were now rimmed with something like surprise at being seen unmasked. There were moments, sharp and astonishing, when truth cut through the carefully varnished skin of our family. Claire's husband, Jeff, who had always been deferential to the family image, looked like someone who had swallowed a lie. "I didn't know," he said, and it came out like a child's admission. People around him blinked, and one could read that in those blinks there was a dawning shame. How many of their roles had been built on ignoring small cruelties that supported an image? I want to be clear, I did not expect magic. I did not expect them to become saints in a night. What happened instead felt more like a fracture, a break that might one day allow light through. For the first time, their neighbors and their church acquaintances saw behavior that had been whispered about as something public. It is one thing for gossip to swirl. It is another for a person to name what they had been made to feel in a room full of witnesses. There was a piece of me, deep and tender, that ached for an apology that landed without a polite clause. Marlene mouthed, "I'm sorry," but it was the kind of apology made out of etiquette, not from a place that had scratched the self. I could tell the difference in the way her shoulders did not drop the way shoulders drop when someone has truly unburdened themselves. "Do you want to stay for dessert?" Claire asked me later, voice an odd, brittle attempt at normalcy. "No," I said. "I don't want them to make a spectacle of it." I left before the pumpkin pie. Outside, the night had a crispness that smelled like frost and gasoline, that sharpness of air that says winter is coming and life compacts to what matters. I walked to my car and opened it as if stepping into another body. Jonah had called while I was speaking, and his voice, when I answered, was small and proud and ready with coffee and a quiet ride home. I leaned back into the driver's seat and felt a heat like after storm lightning, electric and alive. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. I want you to know you are not alone if family makes you small. These rooms have sharp furniture and softer edges if you can find them. Driving away from the Whitaker house, I watched the taillights bleed into the dark like little red stamps, and for the first time in years I felt the possibility of being untethered from their definitions. That did not make the scars disappear. It did not erase the nights spent awake rehearsing survival. It did, however, make me feel oriented toward an ethic of steadfastness. Being consistently kind to myself, refusing to accept public humiliation as a form of familial entertainment. In the weeks that followed, there were ripple effects. Some family members reached out, quiet, ashamed, seeking reconciliation on different terms. Others maintained a distance, as if the social liability was binding them. The town, which had a memory like a ledger, had new entries. At the grocery store, a woman I hadn't seen in 10 years smiled and nodded at me in a way that suggested support rather than gossip. The Whitakers sent a written invitation to a smaller, private conversation 2 weeks after the confrontation. I took my time in responding. I had a day where I cried for the 6-year-old Evelyn who had once believed that being useful was the only way to be loved. That grief was thick and not easy, but it was necessary. I let it wash through me until it passed. I sat the way I have sat with my clients, small in a chair, and I spoke aloud to myself the things I needed to hear. You are enough. You do not have to be diminished so others can feel secure. You can refuse performances designed to make you small. Healing, for me, has never been a tidy arc. There is no single catharsis that cleans the slate. Instead, it has been a series of small, stubborn acts of reclamation. I changed my voicemail message to something calm and slightly audacious. "This is Evelyn. Leave a message, and I'll call you back when I can." It felt like the smallest declaration of autonomy. I met with my therapist regularly and learned how to sit with discomfort without letting it define me. I reconnected with people who had always held me. Teachers, friends from college, the children I worked with. I adopted a tiny ritual of buying myself a small bouquet of flowers every Thursday because routine affection matters. Sometimes, I think about the Whitaker house and feel a complicated knot of tenderness and rejection. The house will always carry the smell of lemon oil to me. Memories are layered. You cannot wipe them clean without also losing parts worth keeping. There are light pockets in the years that raised me that I still treasure. The Sunday dinners that were purely good, the family jokes that sprang from love and not cruelty. But I no longer allow those pockets to be used as cover for other behavior. If someone wants to be loved by me, let them meet the price wholeheartedly. If they want the benefits of my presence, they must also be willing to face the cost of honesty. To anyone listening who has been invited to a similar performance, a sham apology, or a public attempt to repair with the aim to shame, you have options. You can show up and set boundaries. You can refuse the role of shame lamp. You can choose to speak, or you can choose to leave. Both are acts of courage. Both are valid. The bravest step I took that night wasn't the words I said. It was the decision to be witnessed by people who had long been trained to perform and to not let their performance swallow me. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends, because endings are never the same for everyone. Mine ended with a silence that required work, a family left speechless enough to have to reconsider its narrative. For them, Being speechless was a punishment. For me, it became a doorway. Months later, Claire called. She cried and said some things that might finally be honest. Marlene sent a card that said, "I am thinking about what you said." These are not trophies. These are invitations into a longer work, if they are sincere. I have learned to value slow truth over fast absolution. I have learned to keep my guard up without being unkind. I have learned that a family can break into pieces and still be a place where some light can get through, but that light needs honest work to reach old wounds. If there's a lesson here, it is this: dignity is a living thing. It is not something you find once and store away. You have to feed it. You have to name it aloud, sometimes to people who will not like you for naming it. You have to be willing to risk being called dramatic, to be accused of making things bigger than they are. That is a price you'll sometimes pay for simply telling the truth about how you were treated. The night I left the Whittaker living room, I was quiet on the outside and roaring on the inside. There's a taste to truth that is metallic and sweet at once. I'm not naive enough to think everything will be different forever. Cultures, community, families, are stubborn things. But here's what has changed for me. I can look back at the child who learned to be small and say, with no guilt, that she was brave for surviving. And I can look forward and build a life that hands down gentleness instead of contempt. Finally, thank you for listening to this. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone you trust. Conversations like this matter. They breed courage in other rooms where someone might be rehearsing their way into silence. I left them speechless instead, and in that silence I found my voice.